The following is a presentation of VBR. Welcome, and thank you for joining us in our study of God's holy word.
Beginning our 78th session of the book of Acts, looking at Paul's journey toward Rome in the latter part of the book, in the 27th chapter of Acts, Paul was on a ship that was having a hard time making headway. They came to a location in Crete where Paul advised that they should spend the winter, but it wasn't a great place. It wasn't a good shelter. The ship's captain and pilot and ultimately the centurion and the other people on board wanted to continue on at least a little further, to go further around Crete to a better harbor at a harbor called Phoenix, which is actually still in use as a harbor to this day. They wanted to go to a better shelter to spend the winter if that was what was necessary. And so as we pick up in Acts chapter 27 and verse 13, this is the scenario. They are at a location on the south coast of Crete where they don't want to stay, called Fair Havens, and they're intending, as soon as they have a favorable wind, to go just a little further around Crete, a little further being actually quite a few miles, around to Phoenix, where they thought they would have a safe harbor in which they could spend the winter if that was what was necessary. So Acts 27, verses 13 through 20. Now, when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck from the land, and when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus we were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. So here in Acts 27:13, the wind began to blow gently, and they thought they had what they wanted. So this is a south wind, and it's a gentle wind, maybe warm. They thought this was their opportunity, and so they set out. They weighed anchor, and that suggests that in Fairhaven there was no dock for them to be moored to be tied to, but they were at anchor in this very limited harbor that existed there at Fairhaven. They weren't tied up, they were at anchor, and so they lifted anchor, they weighed anchor, and as Paul had warned, even though that was not a good place to stay, the alternatives were worse, and they had made a bad choice. Before they'd made very much progress, a wind of typhoon force, and the term that Paul used, the term that Luke uses here, is the specific name of this specific kind of storm in the Mediterranean. It was a wind of typhoon force that drove the ship away from the coast and into the open sea, away from the safe harbor they sought. And when it's referred to by translation as a northeaster, that's talking about the fact that it was a wind that came in a circular motion, like a typhoon or a hurricane. What Luke used here is, again, kind of a proper name to describe that type of storm on the Mediterranean. They're caught in a hurricane. They're caught in a typhoon, and they have no way of coping with that. Acts 27:15, the ship was caught, and caught is the right way to describe what happened there, and could not face the wind. They couldn't face into the wind. They couldn't prevail against the wind. They're just a cork bobbing along on the sea at that point. And so we gave way to it and were driven along. The seamen were no longer in control, and that's a really important part of this overall story, is that human control is out of the question now in this story. The seamen have no control whatsoever. They're all in God's hands, and no human power can save them. They have no power to save themselves, which is much like the story of the gospel. We are powerless and need the intervention of God in order to be saved. All they could do was let the wind drive them, and that is exactly what they did. They threw off restraints and let the wind drive them. Verse 16, running under the lee of a small island, down south of Crete, They've been driven about 20 miles already at this point from Crete to Cauda, and there is this little island, and it gave them enough of a respite from the fierce winds to retrieve the lifeboat. Now, normally that lifeboat was trailed on a rope behind the ship and just bobbed along behind them. But here, they're retrieving the lifeboat because it's a hazard to them. On the one hand, they might lose it in the storm. On the other hand, it may careen into them, may crash into them in the storm and cause damage. It may cause them to turn. There's various reasons why it was not safe to have it trailing behind them. And so they retrieved the lifeboat, and they tied that down up on the deck of the ship. It had to be hoisted aboard and tied down, and so they did. Verse 17, they hoisted it up. And along with that activity of hoisting and securing the lifeboat, they also passed probably ropes, possibly chains, but probably ropes underneath the ship to wrap it, probably from stem to stern, something like that, but to wrap it and to give some additional structural support to the whole of the boat for fear that the waves and the wind would cause the boat to break apart in the open sea. Along with that concern, as they're passing the ropes and the chains, probably ropes, as they're strengthening the hull, as they're securing themselves as best they can against the storm, at the same time, they're afraid they may run aground in an area called Syrtis, which is an area of shoals and sandbanks on the north coast of Africa. It's North African shoals and sandbanks. Now, they're quite a ways from Africa, but they've gone 20 miles in a hurry under this wind, and they don't know how far they've gone or how far they're going to go, and so they had concern about that. They had no way, had no sun, moon, stars to plot by. They had no way to measure their progress or plot their location to figure out just where they were. They're on the sea, and they know the direction they were heading when the storm caught them, and beyond that, it's guesswork. So they lowered the gear, and probably that's talking about the mainsail, that they probably took down the mainsail at this time to cut wind resistance so they would not be driven as fast or as strong by the wind. The ship without a mainsail would still be driven by the strong winds. Just the profile of the ship itself would catch wind in circumstances like this and be driven along, but with much less force than if the mainsail was up, and with much less speed as they passed through the waves. So they took down the gear. They apparently took down at least the mainsail. Probably all the sails were down at this moment in time. And Luke repeated that they were driven along. In verse 15, verse 17, that they were driven along. Dramatic language, but highlighting, and very realistic language, highlighting the complete helplessness of the people on the ship. They had no control over where they were going or how fast they were going. They had no control over their own safety and the ability to preserve their lives. They were taking desperate measures, but those measures really had nothing to do with rescue and very little to do with survival. They're just holding on for dear life at this moment in time. Verse 18, they were violently storm-tossed. And so the next day, they've been in the storm for 2 days now. The next day, they began to jettison the cargo. And we don't know what all that cargo consisted of. It could have been quite a number of things. We've had shipwrecks of ancient Greek ships that have been recovered. Greek and Roman ships were recovered on the Mediterranean seafloor, and various kinds of cargoes, including wines and metals and scraps of metals and ore, and including wheat. And we can be pretty sure that wheat was a part of this cargo. In fact, it may have been the majority of the cargo, partly because there's some residuals, some wheat that's mentioned toward the end of the storm account here, and also because Alexandria was a good place to ship Egyptian wheat to Rome. Rome had a great demand for bread, for wheat, and Alexandria was a supplier from Egypt for transporting Egyptian wheat up to Rome. So since this was an Alexandrian ship, since its destination was Rome, at least a portion of the cargo, maybe the bulk of it, was probably Egyptian wheat, as is mentioned, some portion of it still remaining at the latter part of the story. In verse 19, on the third day. So first day, they're taking down the sails and tying the ship and securing the lifeboat. Second day, they're clearing away the gear, throwing cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. So now, probably the mainsail and most of the rigging is down and overboard. And some speculate that they may not have completely cut it loose from the ship. They may have let it drag behind the ship as a sort of a sea anchor, a brake to slow the ship and to keep it oriented into the swells. Luke doesn't mention that part, but at any rate, they took it down, and with their own hands, they threw it overboard. So they're powerless before this continuing storm that had them in its grip. The seamen are lightening the ship as much as they can and cutting its profile as much as they can to minimize the impact of the wind that is driving them. These are desperate measures that are being taken by frightened men, by men who are in terror for their lives. And already the idea of profit from this voyage is out the window, and the idea of the ship coming through unscathed is out the window. There's already going to be great costs no matter what happens in the course of this voyage. Verse 20, neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. Luke doesn't give us a day-by-day account here, although I wouldn't be surprised if he kept a diary, a journal of the days as they passed. But many days passed with no sun, no stars. They had nothing to direct them or to cheer them as the days passed in the storm, and they were still in a significant tempest, no small tempest as it's put here in the ESV. They were still in a major storm after several days had gone by. So Luke has gone from the beginning to the next day and to the third day, and then left out any timekeeping for a period of time as their desperation mounted and as their frustration and their discouragement grew and increased day by day. Many days passed. There's no clearing of the storm. They're moving with the storm. They're entrapped by the storm. They're in the midst of the storm. And this time, when Luke speaks of dread, he writes of the storm laying on us, and all hope of our being saved was abandoned. So Luke is including himself, it seems to me, among those who've given up hope, that they're going to die on this voyage. They had no hope. All hope of our being saved was abandoned. The storm was laying on us. Previously, it's been about the reactions of the sailors and so forth, but this time Luke basically includes the entire company on that ship. Luke, along with everybody on board, was reasonably growing despondent in the days of helplessness and very literal gloom, as well as the gloom of the spirits being depressed in those circumstances. The inclination to grow discouraged and depressed, despondent would have been very strong. Acts 27 verses 21 through 26. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island.'" They had been without food. Now, interestingly, Luke doesn't include himself in that statement. They had been without food for a long time. It may well be that Paul and Luke and others in the company continued to eat, but the sailors apparently were not. They were probably appealing to their gods. It reminds me a bit of the story of the storm in the book of Jonah, the first chapter of Jonah. They probably were doing what they thought was helpful in appealing to their own gods, and they were without food. And there also may have been factors there in the long time without eating other than merely personal decision. They were disheartened by the circumstances. They probably were appealing to their gods and perhaps fasting as they were doing that. But then, too, they probably were not doing any cooking on the ship. Cooking called for kindling fires, for boiling or baking or whatever else. And in that kind of weather, with that kind of storm tossing, they would have kindled no fires on the ship during that period in such rough and stormy seas. But Paul stood up to rally them, to stir hope, to give them a sermon, to tell them to stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord. The hope that he stirred was very specific, and there were lessons attached to what he said to them that day. Paul, as on so many other occasions, addressed a crowd. Now, this may not have been a hostile crowd, but it was a discouraged crowd. It was a despondent crowd. It was not a happy crowd. These were desperate and disoriented people, disheartened people who had no hope. Luke said they were all giving up hope in the circumstances in which they found themselves day after day after day after day in that storm. So Paul started out by reminding them of what he had said weeks earlier when they were at Fair Haven. that they would be better off to stay there, and it would be very costly to continue on their way. Now, when I look at that, I could say to myself, well, Paul is saying, see, I told you so. But the reality is, Paul is doing more than saying, I told you so. He's reminding them, as prophets often do, you see, what I told you came true. I warned you, and what I said came true. This is frequently done by the prophets. This is done as a sort of a formula, in fact. And Paul here is talking about his credibility. He's not saying, you all ought to feel dumb because you didn't listen to what I said. He's saying, look, I gave you sound instruction, sound advice, and you didn't listen, so listen this time. He's trying to get them to pay attention to him. He's talking about his credibility. He'd been 100% right about what would happen. And he'd shown himself to be trustworthy all through the experience that the soldiers and others had had with him on that voyage. He's talking about his credibility. If they listened, they could have avoided the circumstance they were in, but they didn't listen. But now they have a second chance. Now they have an opportunity to do differently. So the point was, you didn't listen then, but you better listen now, because I'm telling you what God says. Yet now I urge you to take heart. There will be no loss of life among you, Paul said, only of the ship. So that's good news and bad news. The good news is everyone will survive. The bad news is the economic disaster, yeah, that's a reality. The ship is done. The ship is going to be a total loss. But that's incredible under the circumstances that Paul could say with utter confidence, everyone on this ship will survive. No one is going to die as a result of this storm and the impending shipwreck. It's an assurance that Paul is giving, we are all going to live through this. Don't be afraid. We're all going to live through this. And while the loss of the ship was a significant financial cost for the captain and the crew of the ship and the owner of the ship, and a huge inconvenience and discomfort, they went through some very miserable circumstances here. The announcement that everyone would be saved was certainly good news. Paul was here asserting that the God he served, as opposed to all the other gods, because most of the people on that ship, aside from Paul's companions, were pagans and served a pantheon of gods, none of whom were able to do anything in the circumstances. This is Elijah on Mount Carmel. This is a confrontation between Baal and Jehovah. This is that kind of episode. Paul is saying, my God will deliver you, and here's how it's going to happen. He's laying out a basis for faith in the God whom he worships. The God I worship, that's the God that matters. That's the real deal. The God who can do things in these circumstances. The God he served was quite capable of handling the situation and bringing Paul and all of them through it safely. Verse 23, this very night, the previous night, before talking to them in that morning, an angel of the God whom I belong, to whom I belong, whom I worship, stood beside me. Paul had had a vision of angels, as we say. Would this be the moment when Festus would interrupt and say, Paul, your great learning is driving you mad? Because Paul says, I saw an angel? It might be a moment when some of those pagans had that kind of a notion. Maybe there were skeptics in the crowd. What sort of man, a prisoner, who is being taken under guard to Rome, is saying, last night God's angel told me what's about to happen? Well, the kind of man who had already established some credibility among them with things he'd already said and by his character, that he had demonstrated an upright and godly life and being a trustworthy individual and someone who had his wits about him. And so when he says, an angel stood beside me, they needed to take notice because he is a credible witness, giving a credible testimony. In this case, the sort of man who says, I saw an angel, is the sort of man who in fact had seen an angel, who had had an angelic vision in the night. And this is why Paul reminded them again of his former prophetic utterance, so that they would lend credibility to what he's telling them now. He wanted them to believe that what he told them about God, the God to whom I belong and whom I worship, was true. He wanted them to crack the shell of their pagan beliefs just a little bit and consider the God that Paul served. Paul has preached the gospel of Jesus Christ in other places, including Lystra and Athens, by beginning with the God who created the world and supplies all the good things that people enjoy. and talking about God in those terms. He's taking a similar approach here. Paul told that ship's company, God has a plan for me to stand before Caesar. This is God's purpose. This is what God is going to do. God has a plan for me. Paul's individual life mattered before God. What Paul was going to do was important to God. And because God has a plan for Paul, he says, the message is, it's not the governor or the centurion or the Roman soldiers who are in charge here. Not the governor who held him under arrest or the governor who wrote the letter to send him to Rome. Not the soldiers that seem to be in charge. Not the sea captain or anyone else. It's God's plan for Paul to go to Rome and stand before Caesar. It's God who is in charge. Now, there haven't been any miraculous signs or wonders that we know of along the way here. There hasn't been any kind of demonstration of that. But Paul asserts that everyone's life has been given to Paul. All of your lives have been given to me. God is going to save me, and he's giving me your lives along with my own. This is quite an assertion that Paul is making. They won't die because God has granted Paul their lives. They would survive this disastrous voyage because Paul served God, and God had a plan for Paul. And God is giving their lives to Paul as part of his promise here. This is a little bit of that idea of you are the salt of the earth. You are the salt, and your life makes a difference in the lives around you, very dramatically in this case. Verse 25, Paul says, so take heart. I'm telling you, God will save your lives because I'm on this ship, and he has a purpose. And so take heart. Don't give up. Don't be discouraged. Take heart. I have faith in God. Did he want them to have faith in God? Well, of course he did. But he had to start with the reality that he had faith, and his faith was the factor that made the difference here. I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told, but we must run aground on some island. This was certainly a message of encouragement. Take heart. Don't be discouraged. Don't let fear control you. Why? Because Paul had faith in God. There's no indication that most of those people, other than his immediate companions, Luke and Aristarchus that we know of, there's no indication that most of those people had faith in God, but Paul did, and that was enough. Paul had faith in God. Paul's faith is the reason for the ship's company to take heart. Chances are you know people who take heart from time to time because of your faith. Your faith can be a reason for other people to take heart. Paul trusted God, and they needed to trust Paul that God is indeed worthy of trust. They needed to take Paul's word for it. Again, with the good news, bad news, everyone will survive because God made a promise to Paul, but the ship would run aground on some island. So there were going to be some challenging times and difficult and uncomfortable experiences in the immediate future. Now, Paul was preaching to that company. He was preaching the circumstances of the providence of God, that they could trust God to take care of them. Not the various gods they served in Alexandria or in Rome or in Greece, but the God that Paul served, the unique God who is the maker, the creator of all things, and who is involved in his creation. In very immediate and practical terms, Paul was preaching to these people that faith in God is the way to be saved. Now, he's talking about the immediate saving of their lives, but he's also talking, by way of allusion, about a God who saves souls and gives men not just life out of desperate circumstances, but life out of death. Acts 27, verses 27 through 32. When the 14th night had come, we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea. About midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little further on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. So the 14th night, 2 weeks of helplessness in the grip of the storm. 2 weeks in those circumstances, far from Crete and being driven across the Adriatic Sea, which is the sea between Greece and Italy, which in the first century was considered to contend southward all the way down to Sicily and Crete, and perhaps even further south than that. Luke is right in his nomenclature here. They're going across what the Romans and Greeks called the Adriatic Sea. In the middle of the night, the sailors, could tell that land was near. Maybe something on the wind, maybe something they heard, maybe something they smelled. Some kind of a change alerted the sailors to the fact that they were probably close to land. Maybe the wave patterns had shifted. And so dropping a weighted line confirmed, as they're moving forward, as they're moving along, confirmed that the water is getting shallower and shallower. From 20 fathoms to 15 fathoms, a difference of 5 fathoms. I think a fathom is about 6 feet. So they're moving along here and approaching shallower water as they go. And in the dark, they had no idea of what sort of coast lay ahead. And despite Paul's assurances, they were afraid of smashing into rocks and the ship breaking apart around them and all of them dying. So since the water was shallower, they were able to drop anchors from the stern, that is the back of the boat, the rear of the ship, and hold their position until morning. Dropping anchors from the stern would prevent the ship from turning into the waves, which is what would happen if they dropped anchors from the bow or the front of the ship. The sailors, though, pretended that they needed to drop anchors from the bow, and so they were lowering the lifeboat in the pretense with the actual intention of getting in the lifeboat and heading in that smaller craft that could navigate the shallower waters, heading into whatever shore there was, in order to save their own lives. They were thinking purely of saving their own lives. They could control that smaller boat where they could not control the ship. And they were choosing to leave everyone else abandoned to their death on the ship with no sailors to assist in the final hours of taking care of the ship as it approached the shore. And Paul understood. He realized what was going on, whether by divine inspiration or whether from his own experience or hearing or whatever, but he understood what was happening there. And so, when the sailors were going about this subterfuge, trying to deceive the people on the ship, and particularly the Roman soldiers, Paul had this intuition, perhaps from experience, perhaps by the Holy Spirit, that not only did he understand what they were doing, he also knew what the outcome would be. And so he told the centurion that other lives hung in the balance. What the sailors were doing here would affect them all. To the Roman soldiers, Paul said that if the sailors succeeded, they would die. Now, he didn't say we, he said you. If they succeed in doing this, you cannot be saved. Previously, he said everyone will survive, but now it turns out that there's some obedience required for this particular salvation. They've got to do things in a particular way in order for their lives to be saved. And that calls for them all to stay together on the ship. If the sailors leave, it's going to disrupt the plan. It's not going to work according to the promise. And so they need to stay on the ship. If they leave, then the sailors, at least, will be condemning the soldiers to death. You will die if they leave. There were some conditions attached to the promises of God. The sailors had to stay with the group. And the centurion this time believed Paul. He believed what Paul said, and he and his soldiers cut away the lifeboat and let it float away. They didn't need the lifeboat. That wasn't going to be their salvation. The lifeboat wasn't the answer. Paul's God was the answer. And they believed him, and they cut away the lifeboat. And so it's reasonable to say that their faith saved them. Their faith in Paul's words, Paul's warning. Their faith that came by Paul speaking of the Word of God. At the very least, their faith saved them from a cruel death at sea on this occasion. We'll pause here again, and the final drama of the shipwreck lies ahead in our next segment in Acts chapter 27, verse 33, where the end of the matter with this long drive across the Adriatic Sea in a storm-tossed ship ends with shipwreck, but exactly as Paul had said. His proclamation of faith in God and God's grace proves to be true, just as the gospel of grace and faith has proven to be true, is trustworthy, is a means for our salvation.